The silence was a living thing on Silas Blackwood's land. It had weight and texture, a presence that pressed in on him from the bruised purple horizon at dawn until the last ember of his fire died in the hearth at night. It was a silence he had cultivated, a fortress built of acres and dust, each grain a testament to a life pared down to its most essential elements: work, solitude, and the grim satisfaction of survival. The sun was a hammer, beating the parched earth into submission, and the wind was a thief, stealing the moisture from his skin and the hope from lesser men. His world was a map of harsh lines, the rigid spine of the distant mountains, the unforgiven slash of the dry creek bed, the deep furrows of his own brow. He was a man made of the same unyielding material as the land he worked, weathered and hardened and stubbornly resistant to change. His hands, wrapped around the worn leather of the reins, were landscapes of their own. Calloused and scarred, they knew the language of rope and wood and iron. They could soothe a spooked horse, set a fence post straight, and break a man's jaw with equal, dispassionate efficiency. He rode the perimeter of his property, a daily ritual that was less about inspection and more about reinforcing the borders of his isolation. The ranch was his kingdom and his prison, carved out of the wilderness by his father's sweat and his own blood. It was all he had, and all he wanted. Or so he told himself, every time the silence grew teeth and whispered of the life he had walled away, the ghosts he kept buried under the hard pan of his memory. The smell of sagebrush crushed under his horse's hooves was the only company he kept, a scent as sharp and lonely as his own thoughts. The town of redemption was a necessary evil, a festering wound of noise and people he had to visit for supplies, a place where judgment was served as freely as watered-down whiskey. He hated it. He hated the way the townsfolk's eyes would slide away from his, the whispers that would die on their lips as he passed. They saw the ghost of his younger brother, Caleb, in his shadow. Caleb, with his easy smile and reckless charm, who had danced his way through life, leaving a trail of broken promises and unpaid debts for Silas to clean up. Today, Silas was in town for the worst kind of mess. He was there to collect a package Caleb had ordered, a final, monumental act of foolishness sent by rail and then by stagecoach, a mail-order bride. The stagecoach arrived in a roiling cloud of ochre dust, a lumbering beast hissing to a halt before the town's only hotel. The doors swung open, disgorging a handful of weary travelers, drummers in dusty coats and a woman with tired eyes and two loud children. Then, after a pause that stretched into a held breath, another figure appeared in the doorway. She was small, a fragile silhouette against the blinding glare of the afternoon sun. As she stepped down, the town's perpetual hum of activity seemed to falter. She was a splash of impossible color in a world of brown and gray. Her dress was of dark, lustrous silk, intricately embroidered with figures he couldn't decipher, the fabric stained with the grime of a long journey but still holding a ghost of its former elegance. Her hair was a black so deep it seemed to drink the light, coiled in a severe but graceful knot at the nape of her neck. Her face was pale, a delicate porcelain mask of composure, her eyes dark and unreadable. She was Chinese, and she was utterly, terrifyingly out of place. This was Caleb's folly. This was the woman his brother had promised a home, a husband, a new life. A life Caleb had fled from a week ago, leaving behind nothing but a hastily scribbled note and a mountain of debt. Silas felt a cold, hard knot of fury tighten in his gut. He was supposed to be the best man, the witness. Instead, he was the harbinger of a devastating truth. He watched as she stood by her single, small trunk. her posture impossibly straight, her gaze sweeping over the dusty street and the crude wooden storefronts with an unnerving stillness. She did not look frightened or lost. She looked like a queen surveying a battlefield. The townsfolk stared, their curiosity a palpable, hostile force. Silas gripped the rail of the hotel porch, the wood biting into his palm. This was not his problem. He could put her on the next stagecoach out, send her back to whatever life she had come from. It would be the sensible thing to do, the easy thing. He pushed himself off the rail and walked towards her, his boots scuffing a rhythm of grim reluctance in the dust. Every eye in redemption was on him. He stopped a few feet from her, the sheer incongruity of their pairing a stark tableau, the hulking, sun-scoured rancher and the delicate, silk-clad woman from a world away. He cleared his throat, the sound harsh and grating. "You are May Lynn?" he asked, the name feeling foreign and clumsy on his tongue. She met his gaze directly, and for the first time he saw something flicker in those dark eyes. Not fear, but a flicker of keen, analytical intelligence. She gave a single, sharp nod. Her stillness was a rebuke to his own churning anger. "Caleb Blackwood is not here," he stated, the words clipped and devoid of any softness. He had rehearsed a gentler speech, a kinder explanation, but seeing her there, so composed and so utterly alone, had scraped his nerves raw. He wanted this to be over. "He is gone?" He saw no change in her expression, no tremor of a lip, no welling of tears. Just a slight, almost imperceptible narrowing of her eyes, as if she were processing a piece of data. "Gone where?" Her voice was low and clear, with a precise, careful accent. It held no hint of panic. "Does not matter," Silas grunted. "He is gone. The arrangement is finished." He expected an outburst, accusations, the righteous hysteria of a jilted woman. He was prepared for it, had braced himself against it. She did not give him what he expected. Instead, she looked past him, at the vast, empty expanse of land that stretched beyond the town. "The contract stipulated passage and a plot of land upon marriage," she said, her tone as level as a surveyor's line. "The marriage has not occurred, but the passage has been paid. Where is the land?" Silas stared at her, dumbfounded. It was not the question of a heartbroken bride, but of a businesswoman reviewing the terms of a failed transaction. The sheer, unexpected practicality of it knocked him off balance. "There is no land for you," he said, his voice rough with frustration. It was his land, my land. He had nothing to offer. A lie. Caleb had promised her a piece of the Blackwood ranch, a detail Silas had discovered in his brother's discarded letters. Another promise built on sand. "I see," she said, that quiet phrase landing with the finality of a judge's gavel. She turned her gaze back to him. "The next stagecoach leaves in 1 week. The hotel requires payment in advance. I have no money. You are his brother. His debt is now yours." The statement was delivered without malice or plea. It was a simple declaration of fact, and it was a checkmate. He was trapped by the town's prying eyes, by the ghost of his brother's irresponsibility, and by a code of honor he could not articulate but was powerless to ignore. He could not leave her here, to be devoured by the wolves of this town. A low growl of thunder rumbled in the distance, a sound that promised a storm, not relief. The sky was darkening, the air growing thick and heavy. The decision was made for him. "Fine." He bit out the word, the taste of it like ash in his mouth. "You will come with me until the stagecoach." He grabbed her trunk, the wood surprisingly heavy, and slung it over his shoulder as if it weighed nothing. He did not offer her his arm. He did not look at her. He just turned and walked towards his wagon, expecting her to follow. And, in the oppressive, waiting silence of the town, she did. The journey to the ranch was a long exercise in strained silence. The storm broke as they cleared the town limits, a furious deluge that turned the dusty track into a slick, treacherous river of mud. The rain hammered on the canvas cover of the buckboard, a relentless drumming that matched the pounding in Silas's head. He kept his eyes fixed on the path ahead, his knuckles white on the reins. Beside him, Mei Lin sat as still and straight as a statue, seemingly unbothered by the lurching of the wagon or the roar of the storm. She had not spoken a single word since they left town. Her presence was a quiet, insistent weight, a disruption to the solitary rhythm of his life he could feel in his bones. He had brought a stranger into his fortress, and the walls already felt breached. The ranch house was a testament to his life, solid, unadorned, and starkly functional. It was built of thick timber hewn by his own hands, with a wide stone hearth that was its heart and a porch that looked out over miles of nothing but his own land. Inside, it was clean but devoid of any softness. A man's space. A rifle rested on pegs over the fireplace, a stack of worn ledgers sat on a rough-hewn table, and the air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and coffee. He set her trunk down by the door with a thud that echoed in the Spartan room. "You can take the loft," he said, gesturing with his chin towards a ladder leading to a small sleeping area above. "I will sleep down here." He did not want to share his roof, his air, his space, but the storm gave him no choice, and his conscience, that stubborn, inconvenient thing, gave him no peace. He expected her to recoil from the crudeness of it all, to show some sign of dismay. He had seen the fine embroidery on her dress, the smooth, unblemished skin of her hands. This was not a world she was made for, but she simply looked around the room, her observant gaze taking in every detail, from the state of his cooking pots to the neat stack of firewood by the hearth. Her eyes lingered for a moment on the pile of ledgers on the table. Then, with another of her quiet, single nods, she ascended the ladder to the loft without a word of complaint. Silas was left alone in the main room, feeling like an intruder in his own home. The silence she left behind was different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with her unspoken presence, a question mark hanging in the air of his carefully ordered life. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of damp earth and sage. Silas rose before dawn, as was his habit, expecting to find his unwelcome guest still asleep. Instead, he found her in the main room, already dressed. The fine silk garment was gone, replaced by a simple, dark tunic and trousers that he vaguely recognized as having been packed in her trunk. She was standing by the cold hearth, studying the rifle that hung above it. There was a pot of water already heating over the embers he'd banked the night before. He stopped in the doorway, momentarily thrown. "I was preparing tea," she said without turning around. "I hope you do not mind." He just grunted in response and went about his morning chores, feeding the livestock, checking the fences the storm might have damaged. It was a physical routine that usually cleared his head, but today his thoughts kept circling back to the woman in his house. He worked with a grim, punishing intensity, trying to sweat out his frustration. When he returned to the house hours later, hungry and mud-spattered, an aroma met him at the door that made him stop dead. It was a rich, savory scent, complex and utterly foreign. Inside, Mei Lin was at the hearth, stirring a small pot. On the table, a simple meal was laid out, a bowl of some kind of stew, a small plate of what looked like wild greens he'd seen 1,000 times but never thought to eat, and a cup of fragrant tea. He sat down warily, suspicion warring with a hunger he hadn't realized was so sharp. The stew was made from the salted pork and dried beans that were his staples, but it tasted like nothing he had ever eaten. It was infused with herbs he now saw were from the small neglected patch his mother had planted by the door years ago, a patch he had allowed to be choked by weeds. Mei Lin had not only found it, but had recognized the plants and known how to use them. She ate with a quiet, deliberate grace, her focus entirely on her food. The silence between them was different now. It was no longer a void, but a space filled with the shared, simple act of a meal. For the first time in years, the food he ate was not just fuel. It was something more. Over the next few days, a fragile, unspoken truce settled over the ranch. A routine began to form, independent of any discussion between them. Silas would do his work, the hard, physical labor of maintaining the ranch. And when he returned, he would find some small, quiet change had occurred. A tear in his work shirt would be mended with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. The dust that had settled into a permanent film on the windowsills was gone. The chaos of his supply pantry had been replaced by a quiet order. She moved through his space with a silent efficiency that was both unnerving and, he was loath to admit, deeply calming. She never asked for permission. She simply saw what needed to be done and did it. One afternoon, he came in to find her at his table, his financial ledgers spread out before her. His immediate reaction was a surge of anger at the invasion of his privacy. He opened his mouth to order her away, but the words died on his lips. She was not just looking at them, she was working. With a small brush and a pot of ink she must have brought in her trunk, she was making notations in the margins. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, one slender finger tracing a line of figures. He saw that she had taken his messy, chaotic collection of receipts and bills and organized them into neat, logical stacks. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice harsher than he intended. She looked up, her expression unruffled. "Your brother took out a loan against this property 2 months ago," she said, her voice calm and factual. "He used the land as collateral. The lender is a Mr. Jedediah Thorne. The interest payments are high, and you are 2 weeks from default." She tapped a page in the ledger. "According to your income statements, you cannot make the payment." She delivered this devastating news with the same dispassionate clarity she had used to announce Caleb's absence. It was not an accusation. It was a diagnosis. He stared at the figures, at the neat columns she had created from his mess. He had known he was in trouble, but he had refused to look at the reality of it, pushing it away with hard work as if he could physically beat back the tide of debt. She had laid the truth bare in a single afternoon. The anger drained out of him, replaced by a cold dread. He had underestimated the depth of Caleb's betrayal, and he had profoundly, completely underestimated the woman sitting at his table. She was not just a quiet housekeeper, she was not just a surprisingly good cook. She had a mind that cut through his chaos like a sharpened blade. For the first time since she had arrived, he looked at her not as a problem, a burden foisted upon him by his foolish brother, but as something else entirely. He did not know what she was, but he knew his initial assessment of her as a fragile, helpless outsider was laughably, dangerously wrong. A grudging respect, hard and unyielding as a river stone, began to form in the pit of his stomach. The arrival of Jedediah Thorne a few days later felt like the fulfillment of a dark prophecy. He rode onto the property with two hard-faced men, his horse a fine, gleaming chestnut that was an insult to Silas's own dusty work animals. Thorn was a big man, florid and fleshy, dressed in a tailored coat that strained at the seams. He carried himself with the unearned arrogance of a man who had never been told no, his smile a predatory slash in his broad face. He dismounted without waiting for an invitation, his eyes sweeping over the ranch with a proprietary air that set Silas's teeth on edge. "Blackwood," Thorn boomed, his voice oozing a false heartiness. "Just came by to see how you were settling into your new circumstances." His gaze flickered towards the house, and at that moment Mei Lin stepped out onto the porch, a basket of laundry in her hands. Thorn's eyes widened, and his smile twisted into a leering, ugly thing. "Well, well, what have we here? Found yourself a replacement for that no-good brother of yours? And an exotic one at that. Didn't take you for a man with such particular tastes." The insult, crude and dismissive, hung in the air. Silas felt a hot, protective rage flare within him, an instinct so sudden and fierce it startled him. He took a step forward, his hands balling into fists. Mei Lin, however, showed no reaction. She did not flinch or blush or look away. She simply met Thorn's gaze with her own level, unreadable stare, her expression as placid as a deep well. Her stillness seemed to unnerve Thorn more than any outburst could have. He quickly turned his attention back to Silas, his joviality gone, replaced by a cold, businesslike tone. "I'm here about the note, Blackwood, the one your brother signed. Payment is due, and I hear your creek is running mighty strong this season. A man with as much cattle as I have could make good use of that water." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a declaration of war. Thorn wanted the land, but more than that, he wanted the water that was its lifeblood. "You'll get your money," Silas said, his voice a low growl. Thorn laughed, a short, barking sound. "I'm sure I will, one way or another. You have 2 weeks to find it. After that, this place, the dirt, the house, the water, and everything in it belongs to me." He gestured vaguely towards Mei Lin, the gesture a final, possessive insult. He mounted his horse, wheeled the animal around, and galloped away, his men trailing behind him like vultures. They left behind a heavy, poisoned silence. Silas stood frozen, the weight of the threat pressing down on him, the reality of his situation closing in like a fist. He was going to lose it all. That night, a grim despair settled over him. He sat at the table, staring at the ledgers that now seemed like a death sentence, the numbers a relentless tide pulling him under. He had fought for this land his whole life, against drought, against blight, against the crushing loneliness of it all. To lose it to a man like Thorn because of his brother's weakness was a bitterness he could barely swallow. He felt Mei Lin's presence behind him, a quiet shadow. "There is a way," she said, her voice cutting through his dark thoughts. He turned to look at her. In the dim lamplight, her face was serious, her eyes sharp and focused. "The contract your brother signed. It is poorly written. It specifies the land as collateral, but it does not specify the water rights. In this territory, water rights are often separate legal entities from the land itself. It is a common oversight for men who are greedy, but not careful." Silas stared at her, his mind struggling to catch up. He had never considered such a thing. To him, the land and the water were one and the same. "How would you know that?" he asked, his voice rough with disbelief. "My father was a merchant," she replied simply. but his business was in contracts and trade law. He ensured I was educated in the language of agreements. It is often more powerful than the language of swords. She had found a flaw, a tiny crack in Thorne's armor. It might not be enough to save the land itself, but it was a weapon. It was hope, a sliver of light in the suffocating darkness. For the second time, he was forced to completely reevaluate the woman before him. She was not just a survivor, she was a tactician. The first blow came 3 days later. Silas rode out to his northern pasture to find that the creek had dwindled to a muddy trickle. His heart seized with a cold dread. He followed the creek bed upstream, his horse picking its way over the dry, cracked earth. A mile from his property line, he found it. Thorne's men had built a crude but effective dam of rock and timber, diverting the flow of the water away from his land and towards Thorne's own vast acreage. It was a direct, brazen act of theft. Rage, pure and white-hot, washed over Silas. His first instinct was simple and brutal: ride down to Thorne's ranch and settle this with his fists and his gun. It was the only language men like Thorne understood. He stormed back to the ranch, his mind a whirlwind of violent plans. He burst into the house, ready to grab his rifle and ride out. Mei Lin was there, grinding herbs with a stone pestle. She looked up as he entered, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to his own fury. "He damned the creek," Silas snarled, pacing the room like a caged animal. "I'm going to tear it down, and I'm going to tear him apart." "You will go alone?" she asked, her voice quiet but carrying an undeniable authority. "You will ride onto his land, where his men are waiting for you. That is not a plan. It is a suicide." Her words were a splash of cold water in his face. She was right. A direct assault would be foolish, exactly what Thorne would expect. He would be outnumbered and on their territory. He stopped his pacing, the rage beginning to cool, replaced by a grim frustration. "Then what?" he demanded. "I just let him steal my water? Let my cattle die of thirst?" "No," she said, setting aside the pestle. She knelt on the floor, and with the charred end of a stick from the hearth, she began to draw in the dust on the floorboards. She sketched a map of the area, the creek, the hills, the property lines, with a speed and accuracy that stunned him. He had lived here his entire life, and he could not have drawn it better from memory. "You're one man," she said, her finger tracing a line on her makeshift map. "You must act like a fox, not a wolf. Thorne's men will be watching the dam. They will expect an attack from the front, along the creek bed." Her finger moved, tapping a spot on the map west of the dam. "But here," she continued, "there is a ridge. It overlooks their position. The approach is steep and covered in loose rock. They will not expect anyone to come from there, and just above the dam, the bank is soft. A single, well-placed charge of blasting powder would not just break the dam, but cause a landslide that would make it impossible to rebuild quickly." Silas stared at the map, at the logic of her strategy. It was brilliant, it was precise. It was a plan born of a mind that saw the world not as a series of obstacles, but as a tactical puzzle. He had blasting powder in the shed, left over from clearing stumps. He knew the ridge she spoke of. He had always considered it impassable. "The rocks are loose," he said, thinking aloud. "It will be loud. They will hear me." "You will go at night," she replied, "during the highest winds. The sound will be lost. You will create a small diversion here." She tapped another spot on the map, far to the east. "A fire, something to draw their attention. By the time they realize what has happened, you will be gone, and the water will be flowing again." It was a complete battle plan, conceived in moments on a dusty floor. He looked from the map to her face. Who was this woman? This mail-order bride who understood legal contracts, who could cook like a master chef, and who could now devise a military strategy with the clarity of a seasoned general. The transactional arrangement, the forced proximity, it all fell away in that moment. They were no longer a rancher and his unwanted burden. They were partners united against a common enemy. "All right," he said, a single word an admission of trust, an act of faith. "We will do it your way." That night, under the cover of a moonless sky and a howling wind, they put her plan into action. He created the diversion, a small, controlled fire of dry brush that sent a plume of smoke eastward, drawing two of Thorne's men away from their post. Then he made the treacherous climb up the ridge, the blasting powder heavy on his back, the loose shale slipping and clattering under his boots, just as she had predicted. From the top, he could see the remaining guards huddled around a small fire near the dam, their figures illuminated by the flickering flames, oblivious to the danger above them. He worked quickly, planting the charge in the soft earth of the embankment, laying the fuse. He lit it, the small spark a fragile point of defiance in the vast darkness, and scrambled back into the rocks. The explosion was not a loud crack, but a deep, gut-wrenching roar that seemed to tear the very fabric of the night. The ground shuddered, and an avalanche of rock and earth slid down into the creek bed, taking the crude dam with it. A new sound followed, the triumphant, gushing roar of liberated water. He did not wait to admire his work. He slipped away into the darkness, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. When he arrived back at the ranch, Mei Lin was waiting on the porch, a lantern held high. She did not ask if he had succeeded. She simply looked at his face, saw the grim satisfaction there, and nodded once. She led him inside, where a basin of hot water was waiting. As she cleaned the scrapes on his hands from the climb, her touch gentle and sure, he understood that the line between his life and hers had been irrevocably erased. Their survival was now one and the same. Thorne's retaliation was swift and brutal. He did not bother with the pretense of legal maneuvering or economic pressure now. He had been humiliated, his authority challenged. He wanted not just the land, but vengeance. 2 days after the destruction of the dam, as dusk was bleeding across the sky, Silas saw them coming. A dozen riders, dark silhouettes against the setting sun, their intent as clear as the rifles they carried. This was it, the final confrontation. "They're here," he said, his voice flat and hard. He turned from the window, grabbing his rifle from its pegs. "Get to the cellar, bar the door." Mei Lin did not move. She was standing by the fireplace, her face pale in the growing twilight, but her eyes were burning with a fierce, cold light. "No," she said, "one rifle against 12 men is not a fight. It is a slaughter. We will face them together." Before he could argue, she reached up and took down the other firearm in the house, an old, heavy pistol that had belonged to his father. It was a relic, an antique he kept for sentimental reasons, not for use. He doubted it had been fired in 20 years. "You know how to use that?" he asked, incredulous. "My father taught me," she said, her movements economical and sure as she checked the weapon. He believed a woman's mind and her hands should be equally well armed. There was no more time for questions. The first shot splintered the wood of the front door. The siege had begun. They took up positions on opposite sides of the room, using the thick log walls as cover. The next hour was a chaotic symphony of violence, the sharp crack of rifles, the shattering of glass, the angry shouts of Thorne's men outside. Silas was a good shot, steady and methodical. He fired sparingly, making each bullet count. But they were pinned down, a relentless hail of lead chewing away at their fortress. A bullet tore through the sleeve of his shirt, a searing kiss of hot metal against his skin. They were trying to burn them out now, tossing torches onto the dry shingles of the roof. The smell of smoke began to fill the room. Through the smoke and chaos, Silas saw one of Thorne's men break from cover, making a mad dash for the side of the house, trying to get a clear shot through the shattered window. He was in a blind spot. Silas couldn't bring his rifle around in time. The man raised his weapon, the barrel a dark, menacing eye aimed directly at Silas's chest. He braced for the impact, a cold resignation settling over him. Then a single, deafening explosion erupted from beside him. It was louder, deeper than the rifle shots. The man outside jerked backward as if struck by an invisible fist, a dark stain blossoming on his shirt. He collapsed into the dirt and did not move. Silas stared, his mind reeling. The shot had not come from his gun. He looked over at Mei Lin. She was kneeling, the old, heavy pistol held steady in a two-handed grip, a thin curl of smoke rising from its barrel. Her expression was one of absolute, lethal focus. The quiet woman who mended his shirts and organized his ledgers had just fired a single, perfect, life-saving shot in the heart of a raging gunfight. The great unmasking was complete. She was not just a cook, an accountant, a strategist. She was a warrior. The shock of the moment gave them the opening they needed. The unexpected shot from a second defender, and a lethally accurate one at that, had thrown Thorne's men into confusion. "The back wall of the woodshed," she said, her voice cutting through the din, impossibly calm. "It is the weakest point. It is where they will try to break through next." It was a detail he had never considered. She had analyzed the tactical weaknesses of his own home. They moved as a synchronized unit, a partnership forged in fire and blood. He laid down suppressing fire while she reloaded the heavy pistol with a practiced efficiency that defied belief. As she had predicted, two of Thorne's men burst through the woodshed, expecting to catch them from behind. They were met with a coordinated volley of fire. The fight was turning. Their desperate defense had become a calculated, deadly resistance. The sound of approaching horses, a lot of them, signaled the end. Sheriff Brody, alerted by a rider from a neighboring ranch that Mei Lin had quietly paid a day earlier with a piece of her own jewelry, a contingency plan Silas knew nothing about, had arrived with a posse. They descended on the chaotic scene, their guns turning the tide decisively. Cornered and defeated, Jedediah Thorne threw down his weapon, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. His war was over. Sheriff Brody clapped him in irons, the metallic click of the cuffs a sound of profound finality. Thorne's remaining men surrendered. The battle was won. In the immediate aftermath, a profound silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the smoldering roof and the weary sighs of the posse. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and burnt wood. Silas stood in the doorway of his ravaged home, the adrenaline draining away, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He looked at his arm where the bullet had grazed him. It was a shallow wound, bleeding sluggishly, but it stung like hell. Mei Lin came to him, her face smudged with soot. She looked at his arm, then her eyes met his. In their depths, he saw not the cold focus of a warrior, but a flicker of something else, something deeply human and vulnerable. She took his arm gently, her touch sending a jolt through him that had nothing to do with the pain. "Come inside," she said softly. This needs to be cleaned." She led him to the table, and in the quiet center of the destruction they had wrought together, she began to tend to his wound. Her movements were careful, her focus absolute. In that quiet act of care, a new world was being built between them, a world where words were not necessary to convey the depth of what had passed. He had started this day fighting for a piece of land. He ended it realizing he had been fighting for her. 3 months passed. The seasons turned, and the harsh, baking heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. The scars on the land and on the house began to heal. The roof was repaired, the timbers stronger than before. The splintered door had been replaced, its new wood smelling of fresh pine and promise. The community of redemption, whose judgment had once been a palpable force of hostility, had changed its tune. The story of the siege at the Blackwood Ranch had become legend, spun and respun in the saloon and the general store. The tale of the quiet Chinese woman who was a crack shot and a brilliant strategist had elevated her from a strange outsider to a figure of awe and respect. When Silas and Mei Lin rode into town for supplies, the whispers that followed them now were not of suspicion, but of admiration. Sheriff Brody would tip his hat, a gesture of profound respect that the rest of the town mirrored. The ranch itself felt different. It was no longer a fortress of solitude, but a place of shared purpose. The silence was still there, but it was no longer heavy and oppressive. It was a comfortable, companionable quiet, filled with the small sounds of a life being built together. The clink of Maylene's gardening trowel in the rich earth near the porch, the steady rhythm of Silas's axe splitting wood for the coming winter, the low murmur of their voices in the evening as they went over the new, meticulously kept ledgers. The debt to Thorne had been nullified. The fraudulent contract, combined with his violent assault, had seen to that. The ranch was truly theirs, free and clear. One cool afternoon, they were working together near the house, planting a small orchard of apple saplings. It was Mei Lin's idea. "A tree is a promise," she had said. "It is a belief in a future you may not live to see." The act was quiet, tender, and deeply symbolic. Silas dug the holes in the hard earth, his muscles moving with a familiar, easy strength. Mei Lin followed behind him, carefully placing each young tree, her slender fingers gently tamping the soil around the fragile roots as if she were tucking a child into bed. They worked without much talk, their movements falling into a natural, unspoken rhythm. He would finish a hole, and she would be there, ready with the next tree. It was a dance of creation, a stark and beautiful contrast to the dance of destruction they had shared just months before. He paused, leaning on his shovel, and watched her. The sun caught the blue-black sheen of her hair, and the breeze molded her simple cotton dress to her form. She was no longer the out-of-place woman in fine silks. She was as much a part of this land now as the sagebrush and the ancient rocks. She belonged here. He belonged with her. He had spent years building walls around his heart, and she had dismantled them without ever seeming to try, simply by being who she was, competent, resilient, honorable, and fiercely intelligent. The solitude he had once mistaken for strength now seemed like a hollow, lonely thing. She finished with the last sapling and rose, wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek. She looked at the neat row of young trees, then at him, a small, rare smile touching her lips. The sight of it made something in his chest ache, a feeling so potent and unfamiliar it almost frightened him. He had no words for it, no pretty phrases or declarations. He was a man of the earth, of simple, solid things. So he gave her the only truth he knew how to offer. He walked over to her, his shadow falling over hers. Caleb was a fool, he said, his voice low and rough. He ran from the best thing that could have ever happened to him. Mei Lin's smile did not falter. She held his gaze, her dark eyes seeing past the calloused exterior to the man beneath. She saw the healed wound on his arm and the deeper, older wounds that were only now beginning to close. "He was not the man for this land," she said softly, "or for me." There was a pause, a quiet space where the future hung, waiting to be claimed. He reached out, not to touch her face or her hair, but to take the dirt-stained trowel from her hand, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. It was a simple, practical gesture, an offer to share the load. It was everything. "This place," Silas said, looking out over the rolling hills of his home, their home. "It needs a proper name, not just the Blackwood Ranch." He looked back at her, the unspoken question clear in his eyes. Her smile widened just a fraction, reaching her eyes and making them shine. "We have much work to do," she replied. It was not a romantic declaration, but it was an answer. It was a yes, a commitment. It was the planting of a seed in the fertile ground of their shared future. Together, they stood and looked out at the land, at the row of saplings that were their promise. Two solitary figures who had found in each other a home more real and more resilient than any fortress of timber or stone. The silence that surrounded them was no longer an absence, but a presence. It was the sound of peace.